Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into an issue that, well, it often hides in plain sight.
Yeah, it really does.
We're looking at how recent shifts in U.S. education policy are quietly reshaping, the landscape of knowledge, particularly when it comes to autistic individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission today is really to unpack this profound insight from our source material about how policies, even ones just presented as financial, can end up silencing critical voices.
And defining what even counts as truth in research.
Exactly.
And our guide here is excerpts from Silencing the Questions, How U.S. Education Policy Threatens Autistic Quality of Life Research by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks.
Right.
And this paper argues pretty strongly that what seem like straightforward budget changes, framed as fiscal responsibility.
Always the way, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, they could actually lead to what Hoerricks calls the disappearance of the autistic question from vital research.
Wow.
And the point isn't direct censorship, like banning topics. It's more subtle. It's presented as sort of an economic design.
It sounds like a really critical journey we're going on then, understanding these underlying implications.
Absolutely.
Because policies that look like they're just about numbers on a spreadsheet, well, they might tell a much bigger story about how knowledge itself gets shaped.
That's the core idea.
Okay, so let's dig into the specifics then. How exactly does this policy create barriers?
Well, the source gets quite specific.
Yeah.
It talks about the elimination of federal grad PLUS loans.
Okay, those are the government-backed ones, right? Crucial for a lot of grad students.
Precisely. Especially those without other financial means. And also, new caps on lifetime borrowing for graduate students.
Ah.
These were part of a version of a bill that passed the Senate.
Okay, so what's the immediate effect?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks puts it pretty starkly. The quote effectively says, if you are poor, working class, disabled, or autistic, you are no longer meant to access the doctorate.
That's blunt.
It is. It's not a direct, you can't come in sign, obviously.
No, but it's a massive affordability barrier.
It's exactly. An undeniable one.
And stepping back a bit, the source draws some interesting parallels here, doesn't it, to history?
It does, yeah. It connects it directly to things like the Reagan-era plan to price protesters out of the university, or even Nixon's strategy to neutralize the potential of the campus as a site of resistance.
So the argument isn't just about controlling protests on campus.
No, the source suggests it's deeper. It's about trying to contain imagination.
Contain imagination.
Yeah, and to, choke the questions at the root. It's about limiting the capacity for certain kinds of thinking, certain kinds of inquiry.
And this is where it gets really impactful for our focus today because it hits autistic people disproportionately.
Right. That's a key point in the research, yes.
Yeah.
It highlights that autistic individuals are, statistically speaking, more likely to live below the poverty line.
Right.
More likely to be precariously employed.
Makes sense.
And far less likely to come from families with the resources to support unpaid research work or those unfunded years in a PhD program.
So it's pretty straightforward then if those loans vanish.
Then that pathway into academia for many autistic individuals, it just disappears.
And you lose their perspectives, their questions, everything they bring to research.
Exactly. Their unique and essential perspectives. It's quite sobering when you think about it that way.
Yeah, it really is.
And that brings us right to another critical point about the current state of autism research.
Okay.
The paper really hammers this home. Most autism research is still not led by autistic people.
Right. I've heard this before.
And it's not just like an opinion. It's backed by studies. Fletcher Watson et al. In 2019, Pickard et al.
Yeah.
In 2022.
Okay.
They consistently show really limited inclusion of autistic contributors in, meaningful research roles.
What does meaningful mean here? Like they're not just ticking a box.
Pretty much. They might be consulted, maybe brought in late in the game, but they're rarely centered in the design and leadership of the research.
Okay, so if autistic researchers aren't really at the table driving things, what does that do to the research itself? What are the consequences?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks argues that when autistic researchers are absent, then neither are the frameworks we bring, the language we carry, the contexts we prioritize.
So it fundamentally changes the research.
It leads to a kind of distortion, yeah. The research can end up studying autistic people without us. It pathologizes without listening. It asks questions that make sense to maybe institutions or funders, but not necessarily to lived experiences.
When you say pathologizes, you mean framing autism purely as a disorder?
Exactly. Framing experiences as inherently negative or diseased rather than, say, understanding them as natural variations or looking at the societal barriers people face.
And there's a real disconnect, isn't there, between what autistic people want researched and what actually gets the funding?
Oh, absolutely. A huge disconnect. Studies like Pelicano et al. Back in 2014 showed autistic people consistently prioritize quality of life.
Like what specifically?
Things like sensory regulation,
Right.
mental health, communication, access to services, autonomy, community, practical real-world stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. But that's not where the money goes.
Well, you look at the funding landscape, Rush LR, study this in 2021, and the funding overwhelmingly goes toward early detection, biomedical interventions, and behavioral strategies.
Which the source argues serve.
Who? The argument is they often serve institutional or commercial interests more than autistic lives.
Is there an example of what happens when autistic researchers are in charge?
Yes, a really powerful one. There was a large-scale study actually led by autistic adults, documented by Nicolaitis et al. In 2013.
And what did they focus on?
Completely different things. They looked at healthcare access, provider attitudes, and the structural barriers autistic people face.
So it shifts the whole focus.
Entirely. It
Yeah.
just demonstrates, as Hoerricks puts it, that the knowledge exists, the frameworks are present, the questions are ready.
But access is the key. Access to actually do the research.
That's the bottleneck.
This whole discussion about, who gets to ask the questions, it leads pretty naturally to another powerful force. Commercial interests in academia.
Right. The influence of money.
Yeah, and the source uses a really stark historical example for this, doesn't it? The sugar thing.
Oh, yeah, the Sugar Research Foundation. It's a classic case. Back in the 1960s, they quietly paid Harvard researchers
Paid them to do what?
to downplay sugar's role in heart disease and basically shift the blame onto fat.
Wow. And this research got published.
Oh, yes. Published without disclosure of the funding. And the source states it reshaped nutritional science for decades.
That's incredible. A perfect example of how external money can just twist the whole pursuit of knowledge.
It really is. And if you broaden that out, what that story eliminates is a system where research isn't always guided by, say, community need or even pure curiosity.
But by commercial viability.
Exactly. Funding flows, the argument goes, not to the most urgent or ethical inquiries, but to those with the cleanest marketing strategy.
It definitely makes you question how research priorities get set.
For sure.
So, bringing this back to autistic quality of life research, what's the consequence there?
Well, Hoerricks lays it out pretty clearly. There's no pharmaceutical payoff in studying narrative sovereignty.
Okay, let's break that down. Narrative sovereignty.
It's basically the right for autistic people to define their own experiences, their own stories, without having them constantly interpreted through, like, a medical or deficit lens.
Got it. And the other examples?
No corporate interest in mapping sensory joy.
So, understanding positive sensory experience is not just challenging.
Exactly. And no profit margin in consent-based care.
Which means care models that genuinely prioritize the person's ongoing informed consent.
Right. Things that are fundamentally about autonomy and respect.
So because these areas don't offer a clear financial return on investment,
Those questions go unasked. Not because they aren't vital. I mean, they clearly are.
but because they aren't profitable.
Precisely. It's a powerful argument about how the market itself can dictate the boundaries of what we even think to investigate.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
So this raises this really important question, What actually happens when autistic people are effectively locked out of doctoral programs?
When they're barred from institutional legitimacy.
Yeah. Erased from the very systems we've spent decades trying to change. What's the outcome?
The paper argues it's not just about losing specific knowledge,
Right.
It's bigger.
Much bigger. It leads to a profound narrowing of the scope of human inquiry. Entire frameworks, ways of understanding the world can just vanish.
So it's not just that knowledge gets omitted.
It's that our capacity to generate knowledge is extinguished. That potential is snuffed out.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the listener. What are the broader implications here for you listening, for all of us?
Well, the source highlights something really interesting about power and proof. It says those in power often demand citations as a form of permission.
Permission for what?
Proof. Proof that our experience can be trusted, that our needs are real, that our lives are worth accommodating.
Wow. So you need the stamp of institutional research to even have your basic needs validated.
That's the dynamic being described. And that validation can only come from within the very systems that are becoming harder and harder to access for the people who need it most.
Mm-hmm.
And the really profound message from Dr. Hoerricks' work, I think, is this. When that pipeline, the path to doing these critical studies, is quietly dismantled.
Through things like loan changes.
Exactly. And when the people best equipped to ask the questions are pushed so far to the margins, it's not just one community that suffers.
It ripples outwards.
Absolutely. The impact is broader, care becomes thinner, truth becomes partial.
Partial truth.
Yeah. And silence becomes weaponized through omission, and absence is mistaken for irrelevance. Just because the research isn't there doesn't mean the need isn't real.
That leaves us with a really powerful final thought, building on this source material. The idea that we do not simply study the world, we remake it by asking questions.
That's a powerful line.
It is, and the implication is stark. And this policy has decided our questions do not matter. It really encourages all of us, I think, to consider those hidden costs, the costs of policy decisions that look purely economic on the surface.
But end up shaping the very knowledge we create, the knowledge we consume, and ultimately how we understand each other and the world.
Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive ends.